Good afternoon. Perhaps the most challenging time to give a talk after lunch. The rule is if you snore, your neighbor has the right to elbow you. If you can sleep quietly, go ahead. What's interesting about being here, and I'm very pleased to be here, I think it's an incredibly important topic, is that as much as soldiers go to war believing that only their comrades will be killed, it seems that we also believe that only our neighbors will die. So this conference isn't only about who we are with regard to the people we provide care for, the family members we may actually be at the bedside with. It's also about each one of us. And it's just over a year ago that we had a round table, which was a joint venture between the universities here. And at the end of that venture, the Dalai Lama gave us an incredible challenge. He said, "We all understand the education of the mind. We don't know the education of the heart. We don't know the words, we don't know the constructs, we don't understand the concepts. Therefore, we have no way of communicating with each other, and it's the essence of what we need when we speak of global peace." At a much smaller scale, perhaps, it's the same understanding we need when we're providing care for people who are suffering. And it's my sense that in being with people at the end of life, we begin to understand what it means to educate our hearts, if we can truly be there and listen. Whenever you see yellow, it's a direct quote from a transcript taken by somebody who knew they were dying. Talking about death is very difficult for a lot of us in the beginning. Despite having a terminal illness, one is alive. After confronting death, every day is a miracle. Some of you will be familiar with the Eden Alternative, a whole philosophy of providing care for elderly. And in that context, they talk about the epidemic of the elderly, having to do with loneliness, helplessness, and boredom. There are no heart pills, there are no antibiotics, there are no pills for these three features. And yet, if they are indeed the epidemic of the elderly, what is it? How is it that we might respond? Who has the training to respond to this epidemic? And what does it mean for each of us in terms of our parents, our families, and others that we might be providing care for personally or professionally? And then there's a study done by Peter Singer, who also taught us, or teaches us, in terms of what dying people want. I always think it's sort of presumptuous to entitle a book, What Dying People Want. Really, it's a book entitled, What the People Who Participated in the Study Wanted. But that's somewhat cumbersome, and publishing companies don't like it. So here we understand that it's not just about the physical component and aspects of life. It has much more to do with the sense, or the equal amount to do with the sense of who we are in relationship to ourselves, in relationship to others, and perhaps in relationship to something bigger than ourselves. So how is it that I did this work? I think that the cornerstone of this work rests on somebody I've named Alice. It's September about 1992. The palliative care unit at St. Paul's Hospital is still in the old part of the hospital. And while there's only sort of 2 bathrooms for 15 patients and you got to move them out of their rooms and it seems very archaic, the window's still open. So you can feel fresh air on your face as you lie in your bed day after day. I walk into Alice's room one morning. I've walked into this room every day for the last week, as I do, as doctors do. I'm doing my rounds. And there's something particularly different about Alice. It seemed when she first was admitted to our unit, it would be pain 101. Within 24 or 48 hours, her pain would be controlled. 48 hours, 96 hours, 5 days, 6 days, and it seems not to change. And every day I go in and ask the same question, as do the rest of the healthcare team members. Music therapy, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, pastoral care, pharmacy, nursing. We're all going in, and nothing seems to change. And for whatever reason, I decide to ask a question I've never asked a patient before. And I say to Alice, which isn't her real name, "You know, Alice, I think the pain you've got is a pain that's in your heart. It's a pain I can't touch." Don't know why I said that. And the tears welled up in her eyes. And she said, "You're right. I have one child, a daughter. We're estranged because she's getting married." And I told her, after she introduced her fiancé to me and I got to know him a little, that I didn't think he was the man for her. I had to tell her, because I'm her mom. And I won't be here. So now we're estranged, and when I need her just a little more than she's able to come, she's not here. And if what I believe is true, I won't be here when she needs me. There's not a palliative care team in this world who can understand, or we might be able to understand it, but we can't eliminate that pain. And that was the gift Alice gave to me. I understood a lot about pain management, about symptoms, shortness of breath, constipation, diarrhea, nausea. I can go on and on and on. I was confident about what I could do. But when I sat at Alice's bedside, I realized I know nothing about the psychological or spiritual issues at the end of life. Palliative care, active total care, when the disease is no longer responsive to curative treatment. And for the last decades, we've spent a lot of time and energy focusing on the physical. We need to do that, because if you're physically uncomfortable, it distorts some of our psychological and spiritual experiences. But what's interesting about the psychological and spiritual, if you look at the definition of the word palliative care, it means to cover, to shroud, to veil. And what's psychological and spiritual needs to be uncovered, unveiled, and unshrouded. And yet, in the context of medicine, we always need to have evidence. And best if we can have randomly controlled trials. You know, the drug trials. You give this population the medication and this population you don't, and you compare the two. That's sort of the gold standard in medicine. It's the gold standard in which I'd been trained, in which I'd been working. But I started thinking, you can't do that with this. You can't design a study like that. It needs to be looked at differently. And I realized that perhaps this methodology had to do with stories. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to tell you some stories about the people who were in the study. I'm also going to tell you one or two stories from literature. And I'm going to tell you one of my very favorite stories. If you've heard me talk about this topic at all, you've heard this story before. And I borrow it from Clarissa Pinkola Estes' book, Women Who Run with the Wolves. An old man is dying. He calls his family, his wives, his children, and all of his friends to his bedside. And he says to them, after he's given them each a stick, he says, "I'd like you to break the stick in half." And he waits. He hears all the snaps as people easily break their sticks in two. And he says, "This is how it is when a soul is alone and without anyone. They can be easily broken." Then he gives them each a second stick. And he says, "Here's how I want you to live after I've died. For starters, I want each of you to take your sticks and tie them in bundles of 2s and 3s." And he waits quietly as they do that. They help the kids who are too young to tie the knots. They help the elderly whose hands are gnarled with arthritis until all of the sticks are tied in bundles of at least 2 or 3. And he gives them the same instruction when he says to them, "Now, break the bundles in half." And he waits for the... But it's not there. It's quiet. And he begins to smile after a period of time, and he says, "We're strong when we stand with another soul. When we are with others, we cannot be broken." It's important for us to hear the stories of other people, because even though I've been at the bedside of thousands of people as they died, I do not know what it means to have a terminal illness. I know what it means to sit at the bedside of my sister, my mother-in-law, as they died. I know what it means to hold somebody's hand and tell them I love them as they died. But I don't know what it means to have a terminal illness. Only people with a terminal illness know what that means. The rest of us are left to work hard to understand them. So for the researchers in the group, this will be brief. What did I do? I chose existential phenomenology. Very difficult for a doctor to do research with this methodology, simply because you have to suspend judgment. I'm a judgmental person. Medicine, nursing, health sciences have a huge component of judgment in them. We call it assessment. From the very first encounter I have with a patient, how they walk, they talk, how they comb their hair today, what they're wearing, how they're different from last time, how they're different from a previous patient, it's a constant assessment. And in this methodology, I had to say, I'm going to put all of those biases aside as much as is humanly possible and simply hear their stories without judgment. So whatever they want to talk to me about is what I will hear. It's what I'll listen for. So I borrow the stories and the lives of other people to begin to understand a particular phenomenon. People who had been told that they had a terminal illness, that they would likely die in 6 to 12 months, people who could speak English, people who understood their diagnosis and didn't have an impaired cognitive function. The clinical question, what's it like to get up every morning knowing that the disease process going on within you will likely cause your death? Let's try that again. What's it like to get up every morning knowing that the disease process going on within you will likely cause your death? Existential phenomenology. What is the lived experience of? That's how it works. What's the lived experience of being a dad, of being a husband, of being a doctor, of being a nurse, of attending a conference? Whatever it is, what is the lived experience? What is the lived experience of really knowing, of having been told that what's going on inside within you will likely cause your death? It's different than the existential notions of death and dying that all of us can choose to confront in our lives. Once people have been told, it's different. So, it was completely wide open, as though that the easel and the drawing was entirely yet to be done, yet to be completed. Completely open-ended. I didn't know specifically what questions or what statements to make to get feedback from the people. I know now because of the things they told me. So, because this is as much about me and you as it was about them, I'm going to give you just a short period of time to reflect on some of the questions I might have asked to understand the experience of living with a terminal illness. For example, remember a branching point in your life. We all have them. Some of them are external. Car accidents, moving. There's lots of things in our lives that are external branching points. And then there's internal branching points. I had one when I visited Alice and realized I really didn't understand the psychology and spirituality of dying. So something started to change within me to say, I want to explore this. I want to understand this from another perspective. So I went back to school. So we all have them. Remember a significant branching point in your life. When did you last receive bad news? How did you learn about it? What effect did it have on you? Remember the last time you were in pain? Remember a moment in time when the touch of another person seemed essential to your sense of well-being. What is your grief? What is the proudest moment of your life, your greatest achievement, or one of the moments you most celebrate? What do I need to know about your family of origin to understand who you are? What is one of your family secrets? If you were completely free of living up to the expectations of others, who would you be? Is there anything you would do differently? What does spirituality mean to you? All in 5 minutes on a Monday afternoon. Who were these people? Of course, the common feature they shared was that they had a terminal illness. They knew what it meant to be partnered, married, divorced, widowed, dating, separated. Some were gay, some straight, some childless, some had children, some had adopted children, some were adopted, some had grandchildren. Their ages ranged from the mid-20s to the mid-80s. Teaching, studying, carpentry, nursing, public relations, a wide variety of professions. They lived in the poorest areas and the wealthiest areas. Some were dependent on welfare. Others could do whatever they chose because they had the financial resources to do so. They spoke of their roles as parents, as children, as employees, as friends. A few of them told me what it was like to be lovers. They talked of their favorite pastimes, hooking rugs, hiking, traveling, walking, learning to play the guitar, making music. Their favorite places, a cottage, an ocean, a tree. Their favorite memories, eating ice cream with their children, laughing with their grandchildren, sewing a dress for a family member, meeting a celebrity, conversations with close friends. And in their conversations with me, themes emerged. Basically, I went to their homes mostly with an audio tape and a camera, set it up and started saying, what's it like to live with a terminal illness? I transcribed what they said, I identified themes with a broad stroke and went back to them and I said, do I understand your experience? Because partly what we know from psychology is that in order for me to understand myself, I must be understood by one other person. So I worked at understanding their experience from their perspective. And I'd be going through their themes and say, does this make sense? And they'd say, I never said that, despite the fact that I was reading a transcript. We'd go over it again and again until what I understood to be their experience was their experience. No particular order. These are only in order, this order for the sake of presentation. Time, communication, pain, touch, life review, truth, longing to belong, who am I, and transcendence. Time, it's easy to define until somebody asks us to do so. We share time. There's time that's exactly the same for every person in this room. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours a day. We can go on and on. It's no different for me, for you, or the person sitting next to you. But Ken Wilber talks about another time. He talks about a narrative time, the time that marks the history of our own life story, the time that carries and recreates our hopes and ideals, our plans and ambitions, our goals and visions, subtle time that can speed up or slow down, expand or collapse, transcend or concentrate according to its interest. What's interesting, it's narrative time that changes when people know they have a terminal illness. For narrative time and that knowledge of knowing they have a terminal illness changes their life story, their hopes, their plans, their ambitions, their goals, and their visions. I have no idea whether I'm going to live a year or I'm going to live a month. That's very hard to take, especially whether I'm just living to live. That's what I'm doing. I live to take the puffers 6 times a day, to take the pills so many times a day, to fill the pills up every 4 days. All I'm doing is working with pills and puffers. It absolutely controls my life. It seems that there's an ambivalence that's introduced with the diagnosis of a terminal illness. After hearing words like cancer, AIDS, ALS, time stops. You can't hear the ticking anymore. And one is left with thoughts of, if only I'd stopped smoking, if only I hadn't ignored that lump, if only I'd seen the doctor earlier, it goes on and on to if only. And another part of the thinking goes to the people we care about. Our children, our spouses, our partners, our friends. Time, it's irreversible. I'm depressed. Very much so, because I can't live. I can't live and I can't die. I can't do anything. I can't get interested in anything. I can't travel. I can't go anywhere. I used to enjoy movies and bingos and things. I've lost all enjoyment in them. It's just a matter of living from day to day, waiting to die, and it's no good. It's no good. Making me sick, and they can't tell me anything when I ask them, how long they think it'll be. They have no idea. I know you can't tell to a certain point, but the difference between 6 months and 2 weeks is quite a difference. And in the midst of their ambivalence, and for some in the midst of considerable anxiety, 2 questions emerge. Do I embrace life, or do I prepare to die? Communication. Sira said, speech is a mirror of the soul. As a man speaks, so is he. Robert Frost says, there are tones of voice that mean more than words. And Hippocrates said, do good, do no harm. This was the most difficult theme for me to understand, and I think you'll understand that in a short while. The first thing is, words of Peggy, a woman in her early 60s with lung cancer. First thing is, I trust all my physicians. They've been totally upfront and answered questions in detail. Couldn't have asked for it to be handled any better. They told me what it might be, what it might not be. They couldn't have been more honest. It didn't come as a shock or as a bolt out of the blue. It was just one of those case scenarios they described that they hoped it wouldn't be. Doctor and patient, 2 experts in the room. One understands the knowledge about the disease and the natural history of the disease. The other one begins to understand the effect that disease and its process will have on his or her life. I wish they'd all been like Peggy, but they weren't. There was Max, and I learned a lot from Max, and if I could have 1 hour with any of the participants, it would be with Max, because I didn't believe him at first. When he told me the way they talked to me, the Lions Gate Bridge became a viable option, because within a matter of seconds, all hope was destroyed. And it seems that in that context, the way we talk, the way healthcare providers communicate, can render ineffective all the best treatment in the world. And people remember that moment in time for years and for decades. It wasn't Max who taught me about the suffering, although this is what he said, in terms of his experience in the hospital. He hadn't been taken seriously. He collapsed at work. He went back to see a second physician. He was admitted into the hospital. 3 weeks later, he still didn't have an understanding of what was going on, but he did know that when the nurses changed shift, the chart rack was free. Hobbling down the hall with his IV pole, he got to the chart rack, pulled out his chart, found the page. Metastatic carcinoma, no idea what it meant, wrote it on a piece of scrap paper, hobbled back to his desk and asked the next nurse for a dictionary so he could look it up. Spreading cancer, wasn't quite certain about what that meant. Transferred to another hospital for further investigation. He complained, "I'm sorry they changed my hospital. I liked the other place. I liked the nurses. I was familiar with the routine. What do you think this is, the Bayshore Inn?" And then the doctor came in and said, "Oh, you can communicate. We didn't think you'd be able to talk by the description we'd been given. And I'm not sure what's going on, but I'll go and look it up and I'll come back and talk to you." In moments, all hope was destroyed. This is the only theme I've added my own term to, iatrogenic suffering. Iatrogenic, comes from the word healer, genic, from the healer's suffering. And I borrow the definition of suffering from Eric Cassell, who's written extensively on the topic, as perceived or real threat to the sense of the intact self. A threat and merely the sense of the intact self. Who taught me about this? Marjorie. Marjorie, who was a woman in her late 70s, early 80s. I saw her probably 9, 10, 11 times, mostly in her home. I grew very fond of her. She was growing blind, and interestingly, every time I went to see her, she'd have a different loaf. Lemon loaf, nut loaf, date loaf. She had every different loaf and a different type of tea. And she'd say, "Let's have tea." And we'd have tea, and she said, "And now let's talk." And I asked her about what it was like to know she had a terminal illness, or how she learned about it. She said, "I remember it as though it were yesterday, despite the fact that it happened 10 years ago. I had this mass in my groin, been there for a long time, and they assured me it was nothing. But then one day, the doctors decided to remove it, to excise it. And as I was coming out of my anesthetic in my room, from the doorway of my room, the doctor said to me, 'Oh, by the way, we were wrong. It is cancer. And I've made an appointment for you to see the oncologist next week.' The nurse came along and said, after the doctor left, and said, 'You can go home now.' And she said, 'I'm not going home. I'm not going home until that doctor comes back to do it right.' And I said to her, 'Marjorie, tell me how to do it right. What would that mean?' And she'd say, 'Well, not from the doorway of the room. You'd come in, and before you sit on my bed, you'd ask for permission. And then you'd touch me.' And she said, 'I know all the issues between male doctors and female patients, and I know what's important is to ask for permission before I touch somebody. And then talk to me like you care. If you have to imagine I'm your mom, imagine I'm your mom, but have some compassion. Because it hurts when people tell us and they seem not to care. And then assure us that you won't abandon us after you've told us that we have a terminal illness.' Marjorie didn't say this was iatrogenic suffering. Marjorie said, 'The way the doctor talked to me caused me more pain than the pain from the disease itself. Ouch.' Others said, 'The way the nurse talks to me causes me more pain than the pain from the disease itself. We can put our own discipline in.' This is the theme I've spent the most time on, and I'm going to give you just a very brief synopsis in terms of trying to understand what this is about, because it actually changed my career path. Here's how it goes. I was very angry at the doctors because the majority of people who participated in this study had had a very negative experience with regard to learning about their terminal illness. We now have a 30-hour training program for interns and residents based on this theme. We also have a program that we're working on for practicing physicians based on this theme. I was very hard on doctors. I am one. Until a friend of mine said, "You're a researcher today. You were a doctor yesterday. You'll be a doctor tomorrow. It's not if you've caused pain, David. It's when." So now I've started asking the question, how is it that those of us who are caring people, who have chosen professions to reverse disease process, eliminate pain and diminish suffering, are actually contributing to people's suffering simply by the way we communicate. And we're not even aware of it until we stop. I stopped to do a research project, and then it came at me again and again and again. One person said to me, by the way, I was told I actually tried to kill myself after that. They got my attention. And so now I'm going to just briefly go through my hypothesis. Because dying, people don't die alone. It's like the saying that says you need a community of people to raise a child. You need a community of people to usher people through the dying process. And we know that up to 70% or more of the people at the end of life are in institutions, so they're not going to be surrounded only by their family. They're going to be surrounded by healthcare providers. So we need to be looking at some of these things, not just at our training programs, but perhaps also explore some of these issues at a policy level, because what's happening to us, what's happening in terms of North American healthcare, these are not studied, although we're beginning to do some research in this area. These are hypotheses. One, when you get bad news, you want to shoot the messenger. So inherent in that difficulty, that awkwardness, the iatrogenic suffering, is the sense on the part of the receiver that you just want to shoot somebody. You want to kill them because they've given you bad news. And there's Greek and Persian myths about this. There's incredible systemic changes with regard to the focus on technology, with regard to the Cartesian split. Descartes realized that in the world that he was living in, incredible superstition. So what he did is he divided the body and the mind in a complex way, but said we'll leave the mind, the spirituality, to the church. We'll look at the body from a scientific point of view. And we're still functioning as though that's actually possible, when it's not. We can't divide who we are into segments of physical, psychological, and spiritual. We're all of those things all the time. But medicine is taught from the basis of a Cartesian split. And it's taught from the basis of reversing disease process, of curing, rather than a place of healing, which embraces some of the notions of psychology and spirituality. It means that there's an increased cost to care, an increased cost to technology. There's perhaps also an increased cost to care providers. And there's reduced time with patients. So it makes sense that if I have to do what I used to have half an hour to do in 7 minutes, it's going to be a different relationship. Perhaps it has to do with my sense of shame or failure as a clinician. If I've been taught that my whole responsibility is to reverse disease process, and I'm unable to do that, how do I respond when the person is getting sicker and sicker every time I see them? Do I feel shame about my profession? Do I feel personally a failure, believing that if I was only a good enough physician, perhaps I would be able to reverse the disease process? It has to do with what Martin Buber talks about in the I-thou relationship. When all of me, the physical, the psychological, and spiritual, communicates with all of you in that same domain. Is that possible on a daily basis when I'm seeing a different patient every 10 minutes? Can I do that? Is it too much to expect? How do we change what we're doing in order to deliver care in a desirable way so that you reduce the impact or the potential of iatrogenic suffering? Perhaps it has to do with my own death anxiety. Irvin Yalom writes a lot about death anxiety and basically divides it into two components, based in part on this study, where he says part of our death anxiety has to do with the fear or the concern and the anxiety of leaving people behind. For me, it would be my anxiety about my adolescent children, my wife, my good friends, my family members. But the harder part of the death anxiety has to do with what would this day be like if I weren't right here? Nor would I be sitting in my office or seeing clients or patients. I just wouldn't be. How do we begin to look at that in terms of relieving our own suffering and having a realistic perspective on how we live or how we're dying? I borrow something from Carl Jung. The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. This isn't a parent-child lecture. The greatest burden the patient must bear is the unrecognized, unresolved psychological and spiritual issues of the care provider. How do we do that? Where do we find time? Who guides us? How do we begin to explore some of those unrecognized, unresolved issues? Perhaps it has to do with grief. Grief about a system that isn't like it was 10 years ago. Grief because the technology is growing and still can't cure all disease. Grief because Mrs. Brown died today and she was a patient of mine for 10 years. Grief because I don't have time to spend it with my colleagues like we used to, early morning in the doctor's lounge. Perhaps it has to do with vicarious trauma. Simply being in the presence of the suffering of others can result in trauma, emotionally, on our part. And Perlman has taught us about that, which has to do with the darkening of one's worldview, a change in our sense of safety, or a break in our connection to the spiritual. Perhaps it has to do with a sense of empathy or a sense of identification. I no longer how to separate myself from the patient. Therefore, I take their burdens on as though they were my own. Perhaps it has to do with the workload and the sense of burnout. We've just completed a study in the 3 emergency departments of the hospitals in this city, asking about vicarious trauma, compassion satisfaction, compassion fatigue, burnout, depression, and PTSD, because we know that nurses working in the emergency department at Vancouver Hospital had a higher incidence of PTSD than you would usually expect in that population. So we've repeated that now for all healthcare providers. How do we begin to have a realistic look at what's happening in our community? And how do we provide support? How do we sustain people in the workplace? Back to the results of this study. Pain. Pain is part of the experience of living with a terminal illness. For some, it's a constant reality. For others, it's intermittent. For some, it's a fear or an anxiety that pain is yet to come. All I found myself doing was more of the same. I'm not sleeping at all, so it's getting to a point where in the middle of the night, at 4 or 5 in the morning, I'm tossing and turning from the pain and from the discomfort. I'm so exhausted. It's gone on for weeks. I fall asleep simply from sheer exhaustion. I was thankful if I got 40 minutes, 50 minutes, whatever the case might be. When pain is present, it becomes the focus of existence. When pain is present, attention to that which is psychological or spiritual is altered, and for some people becomes non-existent. I'm only afraid of pain. I'm not afraid of death. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of pain. I'm terrified of pain, bad pain, because I've gone through so much of it. Emily Dickinson has written a wonderful short poem entitled The Mystery of Pain. Pain has an element of blank. It cannot recollect when it began or if there were a time when it was not. It has no future but itself. Its infinite realms contain its past, enlightened to perceive new periods of pain, the cycles of pain, the cycles of hopelessness when people seem to have pain that can't be reversed or isn't being reversed. Touch. Touch is healing emotionally and psychologically. Touch is essential to one's sense of well-being. For me, touch is almost a necessity of life. Yes, it is a necessity of life. We need to be touched. Touching, I think, is magical. I really feel that if it isn't physically healing, it is certainly emotionally and psychologically a way of healing. All I cared about was that someone was touching me and I knew that I wasn't alone. It's so important. It's so important. Touch counteracts the sense of aloneness, the sense of being out of touch, the sense of being untouchable. Life review. Socrates has said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." It seems that a process of life review erupts from within once people are told they have a terminal illness. It erupts into their thoughts, their conversations, and their dreams. It has to do with a process of looking back, I think, to make sense of one's past, or simply to understand a lifetime of memories and relationships, with the hope that perhaps there will be some guidance or some vision about the future. I do a lot more thinking now about my life, how it was and is, what I've done, things like that. The guilt feeling of the things I've done is much greater than the good things that brought me happiness. The guilts take priority. Most of the stuff I wish I could forget about, but it's all coming up. You really do wake up. All of a sudden, all these things that were hidden are front and center. There's no hiding anymore. It's painful. I put it away for so many years. It hurt. Let me tell you, it hurt. I haven't talked about this to anyone. I've confronted my demons. I've faced my demons. I'm glad I talked with you today. A common response after I've been in people's homes a few times was, "I've told you things I've never told anybody, and I only wish I could." And it was from them I got my orders to write the book. They said, don't write a book for doctors, nurses, or professionals. They won't read it. Write a book for others who are on this journey. So like the stick, perhaps our stories will be like passing a stick on to somebody else, where they can tie our stories to their stories, so they don't have to be alone when they're on this journey. And with the life review, it seemed that there was also a component of grief. Because in talking, people began to realize that there was in their lives unconditional love, that they'd never received unconditional love, they'd never been taken seriously, and they hadn't been seen for who they truly were. Grief weighed heavily on people. What is it? Grief is wanting more of what one will never get again. And they knew it. Grief begets grief. It's usually a combination of anger, sadness, and fatigue. It links the present grief to that of the past. It's not rational. It's a pain, a great pain, not in one's mind, but in one's heart, in one's soul, at the core of one's being. It's a beacon to loss. I used to speak of grief and think that we had to resolve it. In spending time with all of these people and subsequently experiencing my own after the death of 2 family members, I now speak of integrating grief. And in telling their stories, people begin to process and integrate their grief. Because they look back and they look at the sadness of broken relationship. They look at the sadness that life is too short to repeat it and change some of the relationships that they might have lived differently had they had the insight, the courage, or the opportunity to repair what had been broken. In that same construct was the notion of truth. Truth and hope are not mutually exclusive. Bullets taken from the transcripts. Truth is very important. Truth is totally freeing. Truth includes the topic of death. Truth is paramount at the end of life. Truth is necessary for inner peace. Only in addressing unfinished business is one able to come to healing and a place of healing and wholeness. A person that's terminal, they don't have time. All they want is the truth. They want the truth from their doctor, their friends, their family. If you don't tell the truth, you play games and you're just wasting everybody's time, and you don't have time to waste. I haven't talked about this to anyone. Confession's supposed to be good for the soul. Just sitting here, it came out because I didn't want to sit here and talk about my sanitized life to you. That would have been duplicitous. A man who had seen many times, and on one of the last visits to his home, as I opened the door of his home, he said, "You're going to be very angry at me today." I said, "How's that?" He said, "Because all the things I've told you are wrong. I didn't grow up in the home I've described to you. I left home when I was 14, and he started talking very quickly. And he started telling me things he hadn't talked to other people about that were very dark. And he said, "I've been held hostage by my secrets, so much so that it's affected my relationship with my parents, with my wife, with my children. And I can't bear it anymore because it means I'm living in isolation." People keep secrets, secrets keep people. And in that sense, as people spoke, it seemed that there was a new wholeness. It's as though we could take all of our lives past, the good, the bad, and the ugly, all of that which we hold behind us, and begin to, in the presence of another perhaps, hold all of the past in the present, so all those fragments can begin to be rejoined and reconnected, because all of them define who we are. All of them, as much as they're integrated into us, actually have to do with our integrity. And what we know in terms of healing and scar tissue is that it may not be as pretty as the original tissue, it's often stronger. So if only people could have the opportunity of speaking, and my sense is when we look back at the epidemic of the elderly with regard to loneliness, boredom, and helplessness, perhaps if we were to enable people to look back at all of their features, people would experience in part a wholeness. And what's interesting about the word whole is that it has the same German origin as the word heal. Whole and heal come from the German word heil, H-E-I-L. Longing to belong. Though I was not loved, I was not as unlovable as I had often believed myself to be. 2 transcripts. I'll never forget an incident when I was about 5 years old. I think this has a lot to do with my fear of abandonment. A man in his 30s tells me about what it was like to grow up in his home, how when he was 4 or 5, one day he was having a fight with his siblings at the breakfast table. And his mother said to him, what are you talking about? And he said, well, they're not my sisters anyway. So the mother said to him, I want you to go to your room and I want you to take all your personal belongings, your toys, your teddies, your blanket, put them in a wicker basket. So he did that, and she came into his bedroom and took the wicker basket, dumped all of his belongings out on the bed, took the wicker basket and the little boy to what he thought was the place from which he'd been adopted. He thought it was the Children's Aid Society. It was actually a hospital in their community. And she left him there for hours, sitting on the curb next to his basket. And people would ask him what he was doing and why was he there. And he just said, I'm just waiting for my mom to pick me up. At the end of the day, she came and said to him, are you ever going to say that kind of thing again? And he said, no. And she took me home, and I was so thankful. It was getting dark. I was hungry and scared. I didn't know what was going to happen, but from that moment on, I was aware that nothing in the house belonged to me. The longing to belong is a deep desire. It is the yearning of one person to be attached or connected to another. It was only after he had been told that he had a terminal illness that he had the courage to begin to look back at his life and to begin to speak the truth, to review his life, and then to say, while that was a very despairing family of origin in terms of being adopted into that family, and I didn't know unconditional love in it, my story's changed because I have a community of people who love me. But I had to be honest first about where I came from, before I could be honest with the people that I now associate with. And then there's the other story that starts with, I say I'm glad I got cancer today because it turned my life around. Now I can see what's worthwhile in life and what's not worth spending any time on. The kind of stuff you used to spend days and months worrying about or being angry about, fretting about, now you look at it all and say, what for? The things that really matter are relationships with other people. Love matters. And I'm not distinguishing between the love of family and the love of friends. They're all loving. Who am I? Not all, but most people wear a mask of what they think people want them to be. When you're lying in a hospital bed and you have your bum wiped by someone, you don't wear a mask anymore. The mask is gone. And people talked about what it was like to be fortunate, to be lucky that they'd been told they had a terminal illness. Because they said all those layers of who we really weren't began to fall off so that we could become who we really were. We could stand in front of the mirror and say, who am I? And begin to have a different answer than we might have had in our lifetime. And it seemed it didn't matter whether people were in their 20s, their 30s, their 60s, or 70s. The question emerged for them, who am I, really? It has to do with what James Hollis, a Jungian psychologist, would talk about as individuation. The developmental imperative of each of us to become ourselves as fully as we are able, within the limits imposed on us by fate. Unless we consciously confront our fate, we are tied to it. We must separate who we are from what we have acquired, our de facto but false sense of self. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. I have faith and believe in myself now that I never had before, and in being who I am. I'm not afraid of being who I am. I think I can face death liking myself now, and I never would have been able to say that. I think that's the big difference. It's shown me that I've got the inner strength. That's the essence of it. And then transcendence. What does it mean? Perhaps the most difficult theme to describe, because an inherent in transcendence is mystery, and a mystery defined isn't really a mystery. But if I were to create a composite experience of spirituality of persons who participated in this study, I would generally address that being as a higher power, but people would also say to me, it doesn't really matter so much about the name anymore. Buddha, Allah, Christ, Jesus, God, Goddess, Creator, higher power. What matters is the sense that there is something within us that connects us to all time and to all space, that seems to connect us to all things universal. And in that context, there also seems to be a notion of unconditional love, which once we've experienced that in the construct of understanding we have a terminal illness, we're able to share that with others as well. And in that same part, there's an acceptance of self. There's an ability to forgive ourselves, and therefore to love without judgment or imposition of punishment on others. And in the strength of this higher power, this is basically taken from their transcripts. One experiences healing and is able to resolve personal and relationship issues, some of which have resulted in self-loathing and great difficulty to forgive. One experiences a greater connectedness to others and finds deeper meaning in relationship. It's an experience that's very personal and private. One no longer feels boundaries and limits of self, for strength, love, and integrity result in a wholeness not previously experienced. This is strongly felt in nature, from the smallest bird through the eyes of a doe embracing a tree or looking to the mountains. There's a wholeness and oneness with nature which includes an extension of the self beyond the self to all that lies beyond us. Peggy. I told you about Peggy. She had the positive relationship with the physician. I only saw Peggy twice. I think she taught me more about spirituality than anybody has ever taught me. And she said about spirituality, it's not just about spirituality. It's about the psychology of relationship to myself, to others, past, present, and then to some notion that she spoke of the higher power. And she said, you know, my journey of transcendence started 7 years ago. 7 years ago when I began to realize that I'd never looked in the mirror and asked myself, who am I? So I'd never made sense of my family of origin. I'd never acknowledged that my mother and her mother and her mother and her mother were all alcoholics, and that I was an alcoholic too. And while I'd stopped drinking years prior to this, I'd never really explored what all of that might have meant, not just to me, but to my children as well. And I'd never explored what it meant that my father was a perfectionist and I could come home with a 99 out of 100, but the entire focus was on the one I didn't get. So I could never, ever satisfy him. I learned that my whole purpose in life was to satisfy adults, to satisfy other people. And I never looked at what that meant in terms of satisfying myself, developing a relationship with myself, all in the course of 2 visits. She said a lot. And she said a lot because she knew the methodology. Her daughter had done a similar method, used a similar method for her PhD. So she'd said, I know what it is. I know this methodology. So then I had to realize that not only had I grown up in the home of a father who was a perfectionist, I married one. So the home that I had created was exactly like the home I grew up in. And I realized that what I was giving to my daughters was exactly what had been given to me 7 years ago. And then I decided to do something about it. I asked for help. I saw somebody, a therapist, a counselor, who could begin to help me on that very difficult inward journey. And I joined AA so I could begin to say publicly what was going on in my life and get the support I needed. So, it's Friday afternoon. I've been the doctor on the palliative care unit for the last week, so I haven't been able to do the research. Unethical. Marjorie says at 4 or 5 o'clock that afternoon to the nurse that's providing care for her, I want Dr. Kuhl to come back and finish his study. So I go, and she could hardly even speak that loudly. I go to Marjorie and I say, you know, Marjorie, it's unethical for me to come. It was unethical during the week because I was the doctor providing care, and I've given that responsibility to somebody else, but it's still unethical for me to come. Because I've seen how weak you're getting. Your energy belongs to you, belongs to your family. It doesn't belong to a research project. And in her loudest whisper she said, it would be unethical for you not to come. It would be unethical for you not to come because I want you to come. And I'm dying. So I did the next unethical thing and bargained with her because I knew what was in the transcript. I said, how about if your kids come? How about if your children come and simply listen? We'll hold to the protocol, but we'll make one exception, and that if you agree, they'll come. And they sat at the foot of the bed. My cup of joy is full to overflowing, and that which overflows is also full. For as that which is physical within me gets weaker, that which is spiritual gets ever stronger, far beyond what I could have ever imagined. An incredible gift to her children, to me, and to all the people who hear about her struggle, to look at her family of origin, to look at herself, and to say, I am going to be the one that changes the future for the generations that will follow, because I will look at my pain. Dame Cicely Saunders, some of you will know of her, the veritable healthcare team. Trained as a social worker, then trained as a nurse, then trained as a doctor. Started St. Christopher's Hospice in England in the 60s. She said, "The dying need the friendship of the heart, its qualities of care, acceptance, vulnerability. They also need the skills of the mind, the most sophisticated treatment that medicine has to offer. On its own, neither is enough. The task for us is to merge the knowledge and skills that characterize all of our disciplines, the humanities, ethics, medicine, healthcare at large, the spiritual dimension, and the behavioral sciences. Issues surrounding end of life are too complex and intricate to be left to a single discipline. We cannot only provide care for the body or only for the soul, but must be prepared to address all the issues consistently and comprehensively, hopefully always with compassion. For in addressing the issues of the dying, the appreciation of the fullness of life will increase with an enhanced ability perhaps to define our own purposes, our own values, and our own life goals. For in understanding the experience of dying, perhaps we'll better comprehend the purpose of living." From T.S. Eliot's 4 Quartets, "We die with the dying, see they depart and we go with them. We are born with the dead, see they return and bring us with them. The moment of the rose and the moment of the yew tree are of equal duration. With the drawing of this love and voice of this calling, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Thank you.